Every major real estate crash has followed the exact same pattern. Imagine if you could see it coming. What if the signs were there right now and you just didn't know how to spot them? In this video, I'm going to reveal the secrets that have predicted every single real estate crash over the last 100 years. But here's the thing, there's one critical factor that most people overlook, and it could make all the difference when the next crash hits. Stick around because what you're about to learn could save you from the next big financial disaster. Let's take a journey through time. The Great Depression, the 1980s savings and loan crisis, and the financial meltdown. These weren't just random events. They were driven by specific and predictable forces. And these forces are starting to rear their ugly head again. What we'll uncover in the next few minutes will change the way that you look at the real estate market forever. So let's start by taking a look at the Great Depression, where home prices fell by 30% nationally, and in some places they fell by as much as 50%. Fast forward to the 1980s savings and loan crisis, where home prices dropped by 5 to 10% nationwide, but in some places like Texas and California, there were 20 to 30% drops. And then there was 2008. Oh, 2008, where home prices collapsed by 30 to 50%. There were millions of foreclosures, many people found themselves without a place to live. And this was all due to the subprime mortgage crisis. But what if there was more to these crashes than just pure economic data? What if the real key to predicting a crash wasn't just in the numbers, but in something much, much deeper? Picture this, the economy is booming, real estate prices are soaring, and it seems like a really good time to buy a home. In fact, everyone's buying a home, so much so that there's bidding wars just to have the ability to purchase a home that just came on the market the day before. It seems like a great time to buy, but if you look closer, the cracks are starting to form. This is where it always begins, and we're going to break down the 3 triggers that always lead to a crash. But I'm not going to just tell you what they are, I'm going to show you why they matter now more than ever. In the years leading up to 2008, home prices increased by 100%. That's right, they doubled between 1996 and 2008. But beneath the surface, risky lending practices and speculative buying were creating the foundation for a bubble that was destined to burst. And guess what? The same types of speculative bubbles formed in the Roaring 20s before the Great Depression, in the period leading up to the 1980s, and current times may go down in history as yet another period where buying was unsustainable, prices were going up, and the inevitable was about to happen. But here's the thing, most people don't realize this. These weren't just economic phenomenon, they were psychological ones. Now, that's just a little bit of a hint of what I'll get to a little bit later on when I talk about the real secret of predicting market crashes. So what are these triggers? Well, keep watching because understanding them could be the difference between being ahead of the game and losing everything. So let's talk about the cracks that are starting to form. Yes, there are warning signs that are largely being ignored. There's underlying issues that are emerging and the market is very much at risk. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is inevitably going to be a crash, but what it does mean is that you should be paying attention. So let's talk about what's happening today. Yes, interest rates have been rising. And yes, they are starting to go down. But the fact that they've gone up and stayed high for so long could lead to some significant issues down the road. And while today's rates may not be as high as they were in the 1970s, they are getting to the point where they are squeezing people out of the market. And there is no indication that they will come back down to previous levels where many houses were bought over the last couple of years at arguably higher prices, but at significantly cheaper interest rates, which led to significantly higher levels of affordability when those properties were being bought. Today, trying to buy the exact same house at a significantly higher price, but with also a higher interest rate, makes not just qualifying for a home more expensive, but also qualifying for one significantly harder. And that is squeezing many buyers out of the market. Now keep that in mind when we start to talk about demand. But it's not just higher interest rates that are causing concern. It's also the increasing unemployment that comes with those higher interest rates. And while unemployment may not be at crisis levels yet, any little uptick in unemployment could cause significant amounts of job losses throughout the economy. And I don't need to tell you why that would have a significant impact. During the Great Depression, for example, unemployment rose to as high as 25%, leading to a massive decline in home ownership purely because people could not only afford properties, but they also couldn't afford to keep the ones that they already had. When massive amounts of people lose their jobs and they don't have the money to pay for their mortgages, that significantly reduces demand for housing, which inevitably leads to a crash or at the very least a correction. And even in 2008, as the economy contracted, unemployment rose, and that led to significant amounts of defaults and foreclosures on properties, which led to more properties being available on the market, while at the same time there was lower demand, which is what led to that 30 to 50% decline in housing prices. And that leads us to the very real issue of loan defaults and insolvencies. As we've seen in past crises, when people and businesses can't pay their loans, it triggers a domino effect throughout the economy. In the 1980s, the savings and loan crisis was fueled by a wave of bad loans that led to hundreds of financial institutions failing. Does that sound familiar? And today we're starting to see the early signs of stress in the loans markets. Just look at the Fed bailing out many banks who have found themselves very much insolvent. And on top of that, we're seeing increases in defaults on both personal and corporate debt. But here's the twist. The economic indicators aren't acting alone. There's a deeper, more subtle force at work that most people overlook. But it's critical to understanding when the next crash will hit. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But first, we need to talk about the early warning signs. Market instability, high levels of volatility, financial stress indicators that are readily available to pretty much anybody, including the levels of mortgage arrears and insolvencies, and of course the unemployment numbers. And all of these are key indicators, leading indicators that a crash is potentially coming. And here's the reality of what always happens before a real estate crash. First, the economy slows down and demand for housing plummets. During the Great Depression, unemployment hit 25%. That's what led to the slowdown in the real estate market. It was a lead indicator of what was about to come, because when unemployment hit those big numbers, it became very hard for people to afford to be able to buy a home. Next, financial institutions tighten lending and the market grinds to a halt. In 2008, when the subprime mortgages collapsed, it became impossible to get any type of loan, even if you were a grade A borrower looking for a prime mortgage. And then finally, the speculative bubble pops and home prices plummet. And whether it was the 30% drop during the Great Depression or the 50% drop during 2008, the results are always the same. And this pattern repeats itself over and over again. And potentially with all the speculative buying that happened after COVID, we're starting to see it happen again, with the lessons of the past seemingly going unlearned. No matter how much we study history, when the market gets hot, people just start buying, thinking that prices can go nowhere but up. And inevitably, they always stop going up and often come down quite sharply and quite quickly. Because the one thing about market cycles is that they always continue. But remember that deeper force I told you about earlier? What if I told you that there's one more piece to this puzzle? Something that could both make the next crash more devastating and could also help you see it coming. So here's the hidden gem, the secret weapon that could give you an edge in the market. It's not just about the banks, the economy, or the bubble. It's about human psychology. During the 2008 crisis, it wasn't just about the numbers. It wasn't just about the banks that crashed. It was fear. As soon as people started to panic, they rushed to sell, and the market tanked even faster. The same thing happened in the 1930s. Fear and panic caused a run on the banks, which only made the situation worse. The fear, the greed, the panic, these emotions amplify the crash, turning a downturn into a disaster. And in today's world of social media, the amplification is tenfold, if not 100 or 1,000-fold. So the next crash, which probably should just be a correction, may be even worse than it could have been because of the fear in the market and the amplification effects that come with social media. But if you recognize the signs, you can see these disasters coming faster. So imagine knowing when the market was going to turn. Not just because of the numbers, but because you can read the mood of the market. That's the ultimate advantage. And if you can read the mood of the market, you can understand sentiment, predict market shifts, and gain a competitive edge. Now, the question is, how do you gain the competitive edge? Well, we obviously all need a place to live, which means we can't just up and sell our home because we think that the market's going to crash. And by the way, quite often, when we start to think the market's going to crash, it does exactly the opposite. So the real way that you gain a competitive edge is by preparing for the worst and expecting the best, which means you make sure that right from the get-go, you aren't over-leveraged. And if you are in a situation where you are over-leveraged and you can just barely afford to make your mortgage payment now, it's probably a good sign that it might be a good idea to downsize. Then on top of that, if you don't have an emergency fund, if you don't have cash available to get you through hard times, well, that needs to be your primary focus. And if you're one of those people who owns multiple properties and the properties that you own are all highly leveraged and you're at significant risk of losing those properties and your fortune if there was a downturn, well, it might be a good idea to start looking at diversifying your investments, both in and out of real estate. But at the end of the day, this all comes down to being prepared. And that's the key word here is prepare, prepare, prepare. And the single biggest mistake that somebody can make is thinking that they can time the market. It makes no sense to jump in and out of the market just because you think the market is going to crash. But what does make sense is understanding that the next crash, the next correction is inevitable, and taking a serious look at your finances in order to make sure that you aren't at significant risk of being one of those people that gets absolutely devastated during that crash is hugely important. And if it becomes clear that the market is starting to turn and you are in a situation where you're going to get screwed, knowing the warning signs, knowing what happens before a market crash, things like unemployment, the things like the economy slowing down, and the things like the sentiment that so quickly changes the mood in the economy are hugely important. And by the way, if you want to know what happens before a recession so that you can be a little bit more predictive on what's going to happen to the real estate market, make sure you check out this video right here.